Hi, everybody. My name is Doug Reeves at the Creative Leadership Solutions. I'm joined today by Dr. Howie Knoff to talk about strategic planning, shared leadership, and student success. Let me say a few words about Howie before I turn the webinar over to him. As many of you know, he's an internationally known educational psychologist, the author of 18 books, more than 100 articles and book chapters. Howie is presented all throughout the United States and internationally, and is particularly known for a couple of really important issues. One has to do with dealing with student discipline, student behavior, student emotional and mental health, and also for his innovative use of the new legislative opportunities under the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. He has been a leader at state and national levels, both in professional associations and Department of Education, but also has decades of experience as a working school, licensed school psychologist. So Howie, welcome to the webinar. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to all of our participants that are listening from all over across the country and internationally. Before we start, I'd like to remind you of some upcoming events. Doug is going to do a webinar on September 13th next week, and he's going to talk about taking the initiative fatigue challenge. A lot of times what happens is that we have so many things going on in our schools and agencies that we end up kind of just unraveling because of all of the activity, and sometimes we have to really step back and focus in on the things that are most important to us. Again, we want to encourage your participation by giving us feedback, your reactions to situations that we talk about today, as well as obviously your questions. And so two ways to communicate with us is through the chat function on this webinar platform, and you can also text Doug with your question directly, and we will try to take as many questions over the course of the next 45 minutes as we can. Kind of a context for our discussion today, which is really going to focus on different elements of strategic planning at a very functional level, is that, you know, we have a recently passed federal law, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, also known as the Every Student Succeeds Act. It is now in full implementation as of July 1st, although many of us are still waiting, obviously, for our state education department plans to be approved by the federal government. But the critical context is that ESEA basically has given a lot of the self-determination, a lot of the planning, the execution, and the evaluation back to the state and the district level. And so there's much less kind of directedness coming from the U.S. Department of Education now with the new law, and a lot more self-determination where we're kind of doing it on our own, certainly in compliance with the law and with the support of our federal agency. But a lot of the activity is going to be driven more at the local and the state level than ever before. Kind of the discussion goals for today is we want to talk about what are the functional aspects, academically and behaviorally, that are written into ESEA that every district and state really needs to focus and attend to. We're going to talk about how to look at a school improvement process in the context of ESEA, but how to connect that effective school and schooling blueprint that we need to use with ESEA so that we have the ultimate success at the student, staff, and school level. And then we're going to talk about a shared leadership structure that is going to align with the school improvement model that I'm going to present, and hopefully that will tie as much as we can together today in terms of focusing on strategic planning and organizational change. Speaking of change, Drayton says change starts when someone sees the next step. One of the critical things to do right now is, even, you know, in waiting for our state plans, is to kind of anticipate at the school and district level what we need to do in terms of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and then begin to build the action plans so that we know how we're going to accomplish the things that we need to actually do. So let's talk about strategic planning and execution. And I'm sure a lot of districts are in this kind of a mode anyways. I mean, most districts anymore are doing 3 or 5 year strategic plans, but now with the new law, this is a great opportunity to revisit those plans and look at, are we going to be able to be in alignment with the law, but also can we add value to what we're doing in terms of the critical outcomes that we all want to accomplish. And so I want to kind of separate the ESEA and highlight some of its most critical components, first from an academic perspective, and then from a social, emotional, and behavioral perspective. And so from an academic, here are some of the major things that districts and schools need to focus on, need to plan for strategically, that are written into the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. ESEA certainly still holds all of our students accountable in our schools to help our students relative to high academic standards, preparing them for success in college and career. The states now can set their own accountability systems, and so we're now going to have 51 different potentially accountability systems, and there is no longer this adequate yearly progress construct that was written into the No Child Left Behind Act. But at the same time, states still need to do the assessments in reading and math, grades 3 through 8, once in high school. They have to break out the data, which has to be reported to the public and the parents every year in terms of data for the whole school and then the different subgroups. And some of the subgroups especially that we want to focus on through ESEA are English language learners, students in special education or students with disabilities, racial minorities, and those in poverty. And again, a provision at the high school level is that districts now can use nationally recognized tests at the high school level for their ESEA assessment with state permission, but they could use, for example, the SATs or the ACTs as the assessment that's done at the high school level. Still, the law maintains the requirement for a 95% participation in the test. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act is trying to encourage school districts to look at the number of tests that they're doing, to scale them down to the tests that are going to give you the best information in the most timely way, so that we're hopefully not over-testing our kids as much as we did under the previous law. Still, we have to make sure that our parents and educators have an annual assessment, kind of state report card or a district report card, in terms of us looking at what the student outcomes are, how the students are doing by the different subpopulations. And there's still the guarantee, kind of the cornerstone of the law, that as students are not succeeding, there have to be definitive steps that the district and schools are taking to help those students to academically succeed. There's a protection, especially in the law, for low-income families and students of color, and making sure that they are not being taught at a disproportionate rate by ineffective or inexperienced or out-of-field teachers. So those data need to be collected and reported to make sure that we have a level playing field for all of our students from all different incomes and backgrounds. Schools have to come up with evidence-based plans when certain groups of students are academically falling behind, such as minority students, students with disabilities. And the way that the evidence-based plan can work through could include a new curriculum, new staffing, coaching or training, or a multi-tiered system of support. And so let's talk very quickly about multi-tiered systems of support. What you see on the slide here is literally what is the definition under ESEA for a multi-tiered system of support. I'm going to emphasize right now, I'm going to emphasize it in a couple of minutes, that the term multi-tiered system of support is actually written in lowercase words. There's no uppercase acronym, there are no capital letters, it's a lowercase term, and this is the definition now in federal law, first time it was ever defined. A comprehensive continuum of evidence-based systemic practices to support a rapid response to students in need with regular observation to facilitate data-based instructional decision-making. So that is the definition now that is codified in federal law. The term multi-tiered system of supports only appears 5 times in the law. 2 of them are in the section that give the definition that I just read. The other three areas where MTSS is specifically referenced are in these following areas. The importance of having a multi-tiered system so that we're effectively teaching students with disability, including children with significant cognitive disabilities, and English language learners to help them to meet challenging state academic standards. So that's kind of the third use of the term in law. Fourth is to provide literacy services to students. And the last is to give teachers of children with disability or with developmental delays and other teachers and instructional staff the professional development knowledge and skills so that they can provide effective instruction, academic support services, including the use of accommodations in the classroom. So right there, two in the definition, and these three on this slide are the specific places in ESEA that multi-tiered systems of support are referenced, and it's mostly referenced, again, in the context of professional development. Some additional kind of highlights here. Nowhere in the new federal law is the term response to intervention. And in fact, quite honestly, in the Individual Disabilities for Education Act, the term response to intervention appears nowhere in that law. Once again, multi-tiered system of supports is in the law in the lowercase with no acronyms. Parenthetically, as kind of a bookend to multi-tiered services on the social, emotional, and behavioral side, positive behavioral interventions and supports appears in the new ESEA law 3 times, but once again, always in lowercase words and no acronyms. So one of the big kind of policy and practice takeaways here is that the federal law, both IDEA and especially as we're talking today, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, they do not require the use of the Department of Education's uppercase MTSS or uppercase PBIS frameworks. Those are certainly ones that are available that could be used, but these are not required in the law. And so again, in the spirit of this new law, that the states and especially the districts and schools are determining how they're going to do their effective programming and instruction for students, school districts can and have absolute right to create their own multi-tiered system and their own positive behavioral intervention and support system. Some additional last academic-related components of the law is that obviously we're still evaluating our schools in terms of the individual student and subgroup performance, and if schools are not making progress with certain subgroups of students, then the state is going to identify those schools. They're going to ask the districts and the schools to come up with a plan. The schools have to receive targeted, locally determined, evidence-based intervention. But then the kicker is that if the implementation of these targeted interventions for schools that are not successful with all of the student subgroups, additional actions can be taken, but it's based on indicators that every state is going to determine on its own. And the additional actions right now are not specified in terms of the number of years that need to kind of elapse where the schools and the districts are not shoring up their academic outcomes. So again, there's a lot of state determination here in terms of the follow-through relative to, if you will, school improvement for, again, the schools that are not successfully hitting all of the markers for all the subgroups from an academic perspective. Very quickly now, the complementary side of the law in the social, emotional, and behavioral area. And one of the critical changes with the new law is that the social, emotional, behavioral is much more explicitly discussed in the law than in the previous No Child Left Behind. So in their state, in the Title I plans at the state and the district level, what both of those entities need to describe is how they will improve school conditions for student learning through reducing harassment and bullying, the overuse of discipline that removes students from the classroom, and the use of behavioral interventions that compromise student health and safety. So there's a real focus now on these areas especially in terms of creating positive school climate and schooling conditions so that students can both function on an interpersonal level, but certainly all of this weighs into the academic outcomes and progress of students in tandem. More specifically, on the state report card, on the district and school report card, every year on the behavioral side, the schools, as an example, need to report on the rates of in and out of school suspension, expulsions, school-related arrests and referrals to law enforcement, and that's a major new addition, chronic absenteeism, another major thrust of the law, and incidents of violence, including bullying and harassment. So you can see some of the concerns in the law in the areas especially of bullying, harassment, but now also chronic absenteeism, school-related arrests. So as a school is not succeeding, with the plan and with these outcomes, what's going to happen is that schools and districts that have high rates of discipline for students in different racial categories, ethnic groups, English learner status, and again, students with disability, if we have disproportionate rates of discipline problems, those are going to be highlighted and identified, and there's going to be an expectation that the school and the district is going to do something to, again, level the playing field. And of course, the major outcome here is to have no office discipline referrals, suspensions, expulsions, or placements in alternative programs. But at the same time, the government is very concerned about the disproportionate rate. In virtually every state in the country, there is this level of disproportionality. And so hopefully we're going to come up with evidence-based and real functional ways to basically knock this one out of the park so that we don't have these levels of disproportionality. Some of the programming that may occur in the face of disproportionality is the programming needs to be coordinated not just at the school level, but also at the community level in terms of organizations, agencies, advocacy groups. We're trying to foster safe, healthy, supportive, and drug-free environments that support the academic achievement with the programs, and again, promoting the involvement of parents in the activities, both on a generic level, preventative level, as well as a responsive level when we have the disproportionality or the high bullying rates or the high chronic absenteeism. And so that's a very quick but certainly critical kind of excerpting of the new federal law and some of the takeaways that we need our districts and schools especially to be thinking about as they're moving into a strategic planning process. And so one of the questions on the table is, what is your district and what are your schools doing right now, knowing that we're already in implementation, but now given some of the things that I've just emphasized in the law, are you hitting the markers, or do you need to think about adding certain things to the discussion strategically that you're having at the school and district level? Doug?
Well, thanks, Howie. That's a really helpful summary of where we are right now. Several people have asked if these slides and the webinar will be available, and the answer is yes. We are recording it. It takes a few minutes after the webinar to get them posted to our website, but we'll make sure that all of you receive a follow-up email so that you are free to share this with your colleagues. And we have previous webinars as well as a number of research articles and things that Howie has written, that I've written, and so on, that will be available to you. I think one of the big questions is, our state has not yet submitted an ESSA plan, but we're already responsible for implementing it. What do we do now?
Well, and again, there is a delay factor in terms of, especially right now, the academic outcomes. So there's going to be at least a year leave of absence where we're still collecting the data, but in a sense, schools and districts are not going to be held accountable. But on the academic side, what I would recommend is that we basically carry on. Every one of the schools I've already been in the past 2 months, I've opened 3 or 4 different districts, and a lot of the schools already have their student proficiency data. And so, I think what you've got to do is you've still got to look at that data, look at the gaps, identify the reasons for the gaps, and start filling in the gaps, but knowing that you are going to have a lot more flexibility to fill in those gaps than ever before. On the school improvement level, we don't have the 4, or they added one very late, the 5 different ways to supposedly help a school in improvement status. I think we have to go back and look at the research, look at the practice, look at the people that are doing the good work the demonstrable work in school improvement and start looking at new approaches or different approaches so that we can get the job done. On the social emotional behavioral, I think what I would do is to simulate right now that we're going to have to, collect and report these data and build the data management systems and start getting the formative assessment on a quarterly basis. So it's not just about an end of the year summative piece of data, but it's looking at progress over time and looking at analysis over time, so that if we have disproportionality in the first quarter of the school year, let's analyze why we have that disproportionality. Is it more student focused? Is it academic curricular focused? Is it teacher classroom management focused? So I think what we need to do is really start planning and doing the implementation, even though on some levels we're still in a wait and see kind of mode of operation.
Howie, I think that's a really important insight, and I guess the challenge that I would offer to our audience around the U.S. is there any conceivable scenario in which academic achievement would not be important, in which student discipline and behavior would not be important, in which student growth is not important? We don't have to wait to be authorized by a state hierarchy to start identifying and measuring those things. And Howie, you just reminded me of another really key opportunity, I think, in the law. The law does say that we also ought to be looking at growth, not just abstract achievement. But how we measure growth is completely open. And therefore, there is a real opportunity for schools to rethink what growth means. And as you just suggested, that doesn't have to be year to year to year growth. So particularly in districts that have high levels of student mobility, some of the most important baselines are happening right now at the beginning of the school year. And we can talk about growth within the same year, by the same student, with the same teacher. That kind of growth measurement, short-term, month-to-month, trimester to trimester, quarter-to-quarter growth, is far more relevant and far more helpful than the more abstract 3-year growth rates that we've been using in the past, which don't really help the current teacher understand what to do. So the flexibility in this law is extraordinary. And I would just add one more thing. One opportunity that the law provides is to shift from only thinking about effects, that is test scores, to also be thinking about causes. Some of the variables in teaching, in leadership, in the student social and emotional strategies. As Howie said, the umbrella that we must fit in is evidence-based practices. But part of what the law does is we ought to be also creating the evidence in real time to test our hypotheses and see if that really works. Howie, one thing that I wanted to ask you is the difference between state innovation, which is clearly the mandate of the law, and district level innovation. What role do you see for districts and schools to be innovative?
Well, I think, the law really is at its roots trying to encourage the district and the schools to do it as much as possible on their own. And so I think what's going to happen is the states will frame out the system. They will provide and suggest resources, but I don't think you're going to see a lot of the states be very kind of authoritative in terms of saying you have to do it this way until a school or a district gets 2-3 years down the line in terms of improvement and not making the kind of progress. But, I'll make one more point and then I'd like to move on, is, again, we've already had, I think it is 18 states have submitted their plans. About 2/3 of them have had their plans already approved. So there's 18 states that know what the plan is going to look like. The rest of the states in the country, within the next 2 weeks, their state departments of education have to submit their plans. And one of the things that was built into the law was there was a requirement for every state to hold many different meetings and go to many different constituencies in terms of looking at the needs, looking at getting input from the different constituencies about what should be in the plan. And so to a large degree, from state to state right now, your state plan, there shouldn't be a whole lot of mystery, even though the state may not have submitted it. But again, I think you've got to look at the state as a guide, kind of a guideline and a framework, and then the districts and the schools are going to be more and more responsibility to really look at the local factors and build in their own innovative approaches. And so let's talk about a way to frame out to move to that level of innovation. Schools are going to have to develop, as well as obviously the school districts, an effective blueprint for school success. And so what we do have is this kind of interplay, as you can see on this slide, of what the state is doing, what the feds are doing, kind of lurking in the background of this slide, but the state, the region, the districts, and the schools, and all of this is potentially interdependent. I know in a lot of states, their regional resource centers or their BOCES or their educational cooperatives are helping to provide some of the professional development and the training. But again, I want to encourage that at the district and the school level, you need to vet through what is being offered to you as an offering of professional development to make sure that the professional development content is going to fit your district and do the right things that you want to accomplish at your school level. So I want to talk about a blueprint right now for school improvement. And there's a number of school improvement blueprints that are out there. And quite honestly, many of us that have been doing this for a long period of time, I think we've really identified research to practice the critical component areas. Our semantics may be a little bit different. Our diagrams may be a little bit different. But, you know, we know how to do school improvement. From a conceptual and from a research level, it's then translating it into practice. And so,
Howie, let me interject with a question from one of our colleagues. To what extent does this apply to charter schools?
Charter schools is interesting. I'm not going to be able to give you a great answer to that because the way charter schools are chartered differs from state to state. So some of them are being chartered by regional centers, some through a university that has a grant, some through a local school district, some through a state, and there's still some states that don't have charters. So every state, how it determines and actually creates and allows the charter to occur, you're going to have to look at the state kind of approach to it in terms of the responsibility lines.
Yeah, I think it is fair to say, however, that to the extent that charter schools are accessing Title I funds, for example, then that is the linchpin that they will have to comply with the SSA, just like any other Title I recipient will have to adhere to the law.
Absolutely true. And so a school improvement blueprint, Project Achieve is an evidence-based program that I have developed starting back in 1990 in Florida, and it's gone all the way up to the point where it's an evidence-based program and has been since 2000 through the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It goes from top down to bottom up, as you will see. But again, I'm presenting it right now as a blueprint for looking at strategic planning. And again, we've learned through implementation, as you can see, in thousands of schools across the country since 1990. And Project Achieve was the evidence-based blueprint and for school improvement, for positive behavioral support, for multi-tiered services for the state of Arkansas. Specifically, when I was the state director of the State Personnel Development Grant for 13 years, we were doing Project Achieve statewide. So from the experience of doing this in many, many places across the country, we've been able to kind of vet through this blueprint, and we're real comfortable that it works in no uncertain terms. And so some of the typical results that we're looking at, and again, align this with ESEA. We've got to do effective strategic planning, and we've got to have good outcome-based professional development. And that's been a big issue, the professional development money that is in ESEA, especially through the Trump proposal from a budgetary perspective. We've got to increase, as an outcome, our staff collaboration and cohesion. We've got to align the curriculum and make sure we have effective differentiated instruction. We've got to make sure that our students are engaged, and obviously the big one is the student achievement and proficiency. We've got to make sure our schools have a positive climate and there's good school safety. We've already talked about that. The decreases in the disproportionality, looking at as an outcome, decreasing grade retention and referrals to special education, and then looking at how we're doing the analysis of our data in a multi-tiered context in terms of students who are not responding to effective instruction or effective classroom management, but who are still at risk, underachieving, not achieving at all, or non-responsive. And then the last outcome that we've always focused on is the parent involvement and support. And so here's a blueprint and a visual of the blueprint, taking those outcomes but putting them on the front end into component parts. So how do we maximize student achievement through a strategic planning process? We've got to use, obviously, data-driven leadership. We've got to do the strategic planning and organizational development. We've got to have the staff cohesion, the consultation, the shared leadership. The professional development has to be sound, effective, with demonstrable outcomes, and the community and family involvement. So those components are out in the extra structure, if you will, but certainly under the umbrella of data-driven leadership. In the internal, kind of the core rubber meets the road kind of perspectives and components, we've got to look at our multi-tiered academic instruction and our intervention, and we call that the positive academic support and services component. We've got to look at our behavioral instruction and our intervention from a multi-tiered perspective, positive behavioral support systems. And you'll notice that those are interdependent because they're interdependent in the classroom. Certainly our academic program is supported by good behavior. The behavioral program in terms of teaching kids good social skills is going to be utilized by the academic program in an interdependent fashion. And then in the core of all of this is, in a very explicit way, the multi-tiered response to instruction and intervention process that we've already talked about for those students who are not responding and for those students who have intensive needs. So here's kind of the blueprint that we utilize in terms of guiding the strategic planning process to make sure that we're getting the elementary and secondary education outcomes that we want, both those that are mandated and those that are consistent in the spirit of the law. And so just putting this into words, solution one, as we kind of frame this as the 7 sure solutions to continuous school improvement. Solution one is, again, the strategic planning. Solution 2, staff cohesion. Solution 3, the professional development. Solution 4, the academic program, multi-tiered. Solution 5, the behavioral program, multi-tiered. Solution 6 is the actual functioning of the database problem-solving process when students are not responding, so that we're identifying the right strategic and intensive interventions, and then the community and family involvement and outreach really being the foundation to everything that we're doing as we get our community and families to support the functioning in the district and the schools so that we get the student outcomes. Let me quickly just simply highlight 4 of these, and especially, again, focusing on the strategic planning. So trying to give you a blueprint for some of the activities that a district and school need to think about in these different sure solution areas as they're doing the planning to do the execution to hopefully have the success with ESEA. So right now is a great time, again, to make sure that we at the district and the school level are doing the needs assessments. We're looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and doing what's called a SWOT analysis. Looking at the resources, looking at the gaps that we have in critical areas, and I'll identify those areas in a second. We need to be doing planning audits, looking at our personnel and their skills and their gaps, the professional development, curriculum and instruction, assessment and proficiency, budget and technology. We've got to identify our strategic planning goals and write and resource the effective school improvement plans. And again, not school improvement with the No Child Left Behind kind of aura. We're talking about the continuous school improvement of all of our schools, taking them from good to great, from great to greater, from greater to really sustained excellence. The areas of doing the SWOT analysis are all of the areas that I've already outlined in the school improvement process. And I've already talked about many of these. So we're looking at the existence at the district and the schools level, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Very quickly, a blueprint to look at the academic instruction and intervention area. We've got to, again, look at our curriculum and make sure that the curricula are aligned with state standards. And I understand that's a moving target right now. We've got states that are moving away from Common Core, building their own. It may be in the state plan that that's going to be required also. But, you know, again, we're in school right now. Virtually every district in the country, Houston and you know, the southern part of Texas aside, we're already in process, and we've got teachers teaching, and so we've got to look at the curricula on a day-to-day, week-to-week, but also as we're planning for next year and the next 3 to 5 years, aligning the curriculum, but also making sure that the instructional lessons are aligned with the blueprints and that we're monitoring students' progress and doing the other formative assessments to look at student growth. We've got to make sure that our instruction is consistently and continuously effective, sustained, effective, and differentiated. And we've got to make sure that all of our staff do an assessment or an audit to see how well our staff are doing in terms of curriculum-based assessment, but also in the areas of remediation, accommodation, modification, and strategic intervention. Because as our students are not succeeding in the classroom, we have to do some of the assessments, little a assessments, because it may be that all the student needs, in a sense, is a remediation or an accommodation or a modification. And so here again is a diagram of the approach that we use, the effective instruction, differentiated, continuous progress monitoring, and then looking at, as students are not responding, the data-based assessments that identify the need for remediation, accommodation, modification, strategic intervention, and compensation. A blueprint for the behavioral side, positive behavioral supports. We've got to look at, again, the data. And we've got to look at not just the deficit data of the office discipline referrals, but we've got to look at the asset data in terms of students' health, mental health, wellness, their feelings of safety, but also their engagement in the classroom. So we've got to go into the classroom and identify the teachers and their ability to demonstrate good, effective classroom management skills, and then also wrap around in terms of the support that they have from a professional development perspective, from a related service perspective, from an administrative leadership perspective. But then at the student level, we've got to look at the students and the degree that they're demonstrating at the appropriate developmental level, the interpersonal, social problem solving, conflict prevention and resolution, and emotional control and coping skills. Because that's the bottom line of a positive behavioral support system. I know that there are other frameworks that do not focus in the asset areas of social, emotional, and behavioral self-management. But the bottom line is, and we've been doing this now for 30 years, is when your positive behavioral support system is teaching, prompting, reinforcing, and sustaining the effective interpersonal social problem-solving, conflict prevention and resolution, and emotional coping skills in the students, then we've got the engagement that we need. We've got the effective group work that we want when we put kids in project-based learning groups or cooperative learning groups, and we're going to address the office discipline referrals, the disproportionality, and the suspensions and the expulsions. And so there is a science to this, and I'm not going to go through this slide knowing the time frame that we're in, but I want you to look at this slide, and I certainly encourage you to email me, and I'll give you briefing documents on this. If you want, I'll spend an hour on the telephone with your leadership team to talk about the scientific foundation of behavioral self-management that should be in a positive behavioral support system. And this is what we did as part of our process across the state of Arkansas, even though other states are doing other frameworks, which quite honestly may or may not be successful, and here are some alternative ways to do it. In the multi-tiered perspective, last kind of area to overview, kind of again a blueprint. We've got a multi-tiered perspective, but I just want to make a couple of quick points. One is that the multi-tiers or the three-tiered system is not about percentages. It's not about the place of service delivery. It's not about who's doing the service delivery. What a multi-tiered system needs to be focused on is the intensity of services, supports, strategies, and programs that students need in specific areas to get specific outcomes so that we get the job done relative to the academics and the social, emotional, and behavioral. The multi-tiered system, the research has been very clear, largely has not been successful, especially on the academic level. On the behavioral level, the research and practice has been cleared, including reports by the federal government, that a lot of schools never get to Tier 2 and Tier 3, even though the Tier 2 and Tier 3 behaviors of some of the students are interfering with the Tier 1 instruction. And so we have to have a sound multi-tiered process, which means that we've got to have student assistance teams, we've got to have the data to be able to figure out the underlying reasons why students are not successful, and then we have to have the ability to do the intervention or the instructional modifications that are needed to hopefully solve the problem. So very quick discussions.
So let me check our question function here, Howie, and say more about the focus of strategic planning. Is that at the building level, the district level, or the state level?
Well, I mean, the state needs to be doing this, and in a sense it is doing it. But I guess I want to focus, to answer the question, really at the district and the school level. And it's really got to be a top-down, bottom-up kind of approach. Because certainly if you're only doing strategic planning at an individual school, that's like fighting a ground war without air support, because if the district is not synchronized to what you need in terms of resources or professional development or even curriculum and instruction, then you're basically at the front of a parade, but it's a parade of one. So there's got to be a blended approach, and this is some of the stuff that we do. I've been working for the last year out in outside of Redding, California, with the Cascade Union Elementary School District, and we've done the top-down, bottom-up, and so that we have a core group of people who are doing the district level, but on the district level team are representatives from the different constituencies from the different schools. And so it's really a blended process, because you've got to have the right hand and the left hand in synchronization. Otherwise, you end up with a plan that's not going to be executed. Let me do the last segment, and then we'll have a couple of more minutes. And so I want to focus on just one more solution, and I'm going to be able to do this very quickly. But I want to focus on shared leadership. And again, kind of the question that was just asked, I think is very important here, because you've got to do that strategic planning also from a shared leadership perspective, as I've already outlined. So some of the things that we do in this area, and we recommend that districts and schools do, is first of all to look at, relative to shared leadership and especially consultation and teaming, to look at what resources you have in the school and the district. And so we help schools to develop resource directors that basically are two-page kind of biographies of every staff person and what their certifications are in, what their skill levels are in terms of other professional development, what their talents and hobbies are, and so on. Because a lot of times there's a lot of talent in a school district, but we don't know where that talent is. The shared leadership, looking at a committee structure, which I'm going to talk about in 1 second. And then there's everything that we need to do in terms of making sure that we have effective group process and leadership so that our teams and our committees are actually running on all cylinders. So here's very quickly a blueprint in terms of looking at a leadership structure, and I'm going to focus right now on the school, although you can certainly adapt this or use this at the district level. If we have this blueprint, which I've already talked about in terms of school improvement, all you have to do is to take this blueprint and operationalize it into a committee structure for a school. Now again, depending on the size of the school, depending on the grade levels in the school, you may not be able to have all of these committees, but you start with this blueprint. And so again, from the different component parts of the effective school and schooling model, a curriculum and instruction committee, a school climate and student discipline committee, professional development teacher mentoring committee, a parent and community outreach committee, and then your multi-tiered team, which could be your student assistance team, your student support team. We happen to call it a sprint team, which is school prevention, review, and intervention team. We have co-chairs that are instructional staff of all of these different committees. And those co-chairs become the core of the leadership team. All of the administrators are ex officio to all of the committees. And so they've got enough to do. We don't have them typically be a committee chair. But what we do very early on in the strategic planning process is we recognize that we've got to get feedback from these different component parts. But in order to do the work of the strategic plan, if you've got this shared leadership committee-focused approach, then different committees are doing the different work of the actual action plan or the school improvement plan that you've written and approved. Now, again, you've got grade level teams certainly under this. You've got your related services folks and so on. But those are all of those different people are going to be represented on each of those teams. And so, again, as an example, if you had 4 teachers at every grade level in an elementary school, what you would do is you would have 1 teacher on each of the 4 committees that you can see. One teacher would represent the kindergarten, as an example, on curriculum and instruction. Another one from kindergarten on behavior discipline and behavior management. Another one on parent and community outreach. So each of your committees now has cross-grade representation, and then you add in music, art, PE, your related services, your paraprofessional, your school resource officers, and so on. So this is where we start with the blueprint. Your student assistance team is a more specialized team. It has the best academic or behavioral intervention specialists on that team. And then the group process is basically that you're looking at your school improvement plan, and different committees become responsible for different facets of that plan. The committees are meeting on a monthly basis. They have a mission, role, and function document. They're doing formative evaluation in terms of how they are meeting their goals and the outcomes that are written into their committee plan. And then we make sure that the committees are cross-collaborating, so all the co-chairs are meeting once a month on the school leadership team, so that we have a fluid communication process across committees as well as across administration. And so what we tried to do today is to talk about what is in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Try to give you an effective schools framework from our work, 30 years working across the country in terms of school improvement, but give you blocks of areas in the school improvement model to look at in terms of your strategic planning relative to needs assessment, resource analysis, and your SWOT analyses, and then talked about more specifically some of the different areas that we outlined and finished with a shared leadership blueprint that can get the job done, both in terms of the needs assessments, writing the strategic plan, but then most importantly, executing the strategic plan. Doug?
Well, I want to express my thanks to Dr. Howie Knoff for his broad-ranging expertise, not just on the new law, but also on student achievement and student social and emotional well-being as well. Howie, thanks for your expertise and thanks for sharing it. I want to tell our participants that Howie and I are both willing to give you personal interactive video experiences with your leadership team so that you can ask the questions that are most relevant to you. You're also able to download a lot of free videos, free articles, and other commentary at creativeleadership.net, and I would encourage you to be in contact with us. I'll make sure also, in response to several questions that you raised, that everybody has the opportunity to receive the actual recording of the audio and video from today's webinar. Howie, thanks so much for your assistance today. Thanks to our audience for listening. Have a great rest of the week.